Mira Voss stood in front of the review panel with her hands locked behind her back, waiting for words that would end everything she had trained for. The room was cold, built from pale metal that seemed to hum with quiet judgment. 5 alien officials sat above her on a raised platform, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She had passed every test. She had scored higher than any pilot in her class. And still, the answer came. "Application denied," said the lead official, a tall being with silver skin and slow, careful movements. "Terran officers are not permitted to serve in Concordat combat operations." Mira felt her chest tighten. "May I ask why? My scores are on record. My simulations were flawless." The official did not blink. "Your scores are not in question, Lieutenant Voss. Your species is." The words landed like a slap. Around the chamber, other officers from a dozen worlds watched her with expressions she could not fully read, some with pity, some with something closer to fear. She turned and walked out of the chamber without another word, her boots striking the floor in short, hard steps. Outside, the corridors of the orbital station stretched in every direction, filled with beings of every shape and color, all part of the great alliance known as the Concordat. Humanity had joined this alliance only a few decades earlier, welcomed with cautious optimism after centuries of isolation. Ships were built together, trade routes were opened, Terran engineers helped design new defense systems. But when it came to war, actual sanctioned war, humans were kept far from the front lines, kept out of every fleet, kept out of every campaign. Mira had heard the official reasons before. Unpredictable escalation patterns, insufficient discipline in combat, lack of experience with interstellar warfare protocols. She had accepted these explanations once, back when she was young, and still trying to prove herself worthy of a uniform. But something about the official's tone today was different. There had been a flicker of something else beneath his calm expression. Not disapproval, not doubt. Fear. She had seen that look before, on the faces of older officers whenever the topic of Terran combat history came up. Whenever someone mentioned a place called Vantrell, conversations would stop. Veterans would look away. Once, she had asked an aging Dravith commander named Leora Vane about it, and the woman had simply said, "Some doors are closed for a reason, child. Do not knock on them." Mira walked to the observation deck, where a curved window looked out over the endless stretch of stars. Ships moved slowly across the black, carrying supplies, diplomats and soldiers from 100 different worlds. Humanity had earned a place among them. It had built cities on new planets, formed alliances, contributed technology that saved thousands of lives during natural disasters on allied worlds. And yet, when it came to the one thing every other species was allowed to do, defend the galaxy in sanctioned conflict, Terrans were locked out. She thought about her grandfather, a man who had served during the early years of contact, back when tensions with a hostile faction called the Skarn Ascendancy were rising along the Outer Rim. He had once mentioned, almost in passing, that he had fought in a battle so significant that Concordat historians still studied it. He never explained further. When she pressed him, he only shook his head and changed the subject, his eyes distant, as if remembering something he wished he could forget. "Some things are better left buried," he had told her. Now, standing at the window with her application freshly rejected, Mira felt an old curiosity awaken inside her. If humanity had been so poorly regarded, why did old veterans speak of Terran soldiers with such quiet unease? If humans were truly reckless and undisciplined, why did the Concordat archives concerning early Terran battles remain locked behind layers of restricted access? She decided, right there at the window, that she would find out the truth. Not the official story, not the polished version fed to new recruits. The real reason behind the ban. Her friend Daniel Pike found her an hour later in the station's mess hall, staring at a cup of untouched tea. Daniel was a fellow Terran, a communications specialist with an easy smile and a habit of noticing when something weighed on someone's mind. "They said no again, didn't they?" he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "They didn't even try to hide it this time," Mira said. "It's not about skill. It's about being human." Daniel leaned back, arms crossed. "You know what my father used to say? He said the day they let us fight is the day they stop sleeping soundly." Mira looked up. "What does that mean?" "I don't know exactly. He served in a support unit years ago. Back before I was born. He never talked about it much. But once, when he had too much to drink, he said something about a battle that changed how every species in the Concordat looked at us. He wouldn't say the name. He just went quiet and stared at the wall for the rest of the night. Mira's pulse quickened. Vantrell, she said softly. Have you heard that name? Daniel's easy expression faded. Where did you hear that? Commander Vane mentioned it once, just barely. She looked like she wanted to swallow the word back the second it left her mouth. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. If that's the place I think it is, there's almost nothing about it in the public archives. It's classified under something called Directive 9. Only senior Concordat officers have access. Then I need someone with senior access, Mira said. You're not thinking about doing something reckless, are you? Daniel asked, though the small smile tugging at his mouth suggested he already knew the answer. I've spent my whole life being told my people are dangerous, unpredictable, unworthy of trust in a fight, Mira said. I want to know why. I deserve to know why. And if there's a story buried under all these locked files, I'm going to find it. Daniel studied her for a moment, then sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. You know, if you go digging into Directive 9 files, you could lose your commission. Maybe worse. I already lost my chance to serve, Mira said. What else is there to lose? Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the mess hall, checking that no one nearby could overhear them. The room was busy with the noise of a dozen conversations, plates clinking, alien laughter echoing from a nearby table, where a group of Dravith engineers celebrated the completion of a new supply route. None of it felt like it belonged to Mira anymore. She had spent 5 years training for a life among the stars, only to be told, again and again, that the stars themselves were not fully open to her. There's something else, Daniel said quietly. Something I probably shouldn't tell you, but I think you deserve to know it anyway. Mira leaned forward. What is it? 6 months ago, before you transferred here, there was a closed hearing about expanding the Joint Fleet program. My supervisor sat in on part of it as a technical advisor. She told me, off the record, that someone brought up the idea of finally lifting restrictions on Terran combat roles. It didn't go anywhere, but she said the reaction in the room was strange. Not angry, not dismissive, just uneasy. Like the idea itself made people nervous, in a way that didn't match the usual arguments about readiness or training. Uneasy how? Mira asked. She said one of the older delegates left the room without speaking, just stood up and walked out the moment the topic was raised. No explanation, no follow-up, as if the subject itself was something people preferred not to sit with for very long. Mira turned this over in her mind. It matched everything else she had noticed since arriving at the station. The way conversations shifted whenever her species came up in the context of war. The way older officers grew quiet. The way even casual mentions of Terran history and old conflicts seemed to carry a strange, unspoken weight. That night, unable to sleep, Mira pulled up her personal training record and scrolled slowly through years of simulation results, tactical assessments, and instructor notes. Every evaluation praised her decision-making under pressure. Every simulated command scenario she had led ended with fewer simulated losses than the average score across her graduating class. On paper, she was exactly the kind of officer the Concordat claimed to want. And yet the door remained closed. She thought about her childhood on Earth, in a small town where her mother had worked as a structural engineer helping to rebuild coastal cities after decades of slow climate recovery efforts, and her father had served 2 terms in the Planetary Defense Corps before retiring quietly, never speaking much about what he had seen. Mira had grown up surrounded by people who valued careful, patient work, engineers, teachers, doctors, yet she had always felt a pull toward something more immediate, more decisive. She wanted to be the kind of person who acted when action was needed, not the kind who waited for permission that might never come. Perhaps, she thought, that was exactly the trait the Concordat feared. The following morning, she requested a private meeting with Commander Vane, the only senior officer who had ever spoken to her, however briefly, about the deeper history behind the ban. She did not expect a quick answer. She expected, at best, a repeated warning to leave the matter alone, but something in her refused to accept silence as a final answer any longer. She drafted her message carefully, choosing her words to sound respectful, rather than demanding, hoping it would be enough to earn at least a few minutes of the commander's time. Then she sent it, closed her terminal, and sat alone in the quiet of her quarters, staring at the star charts pinned to her wall, wondering how many other Terran officers before her had asked the same questions and simply been told, gently but firmly, to stop. That night, alone in her quarters, Mira opened her terminal and began searching through everything she was allowed to access. Public records on the founding of the Concordat, summaries of early diplomatic meetings between Earth and the Alliance, basic accounts of joint training exercises, all of it polished, all of it careful, all of it missing the one thing she wanted most. She typed the word Vantrell into the search field. No results found. Records restricted under Directive 9. She sat back in her chair, staring at the message. A single planet name, powerful enough to erase itself from every accessible database in Concordat space. Whatever had happened there was not simply forgotten. It had been buried on purpose, sealed away by people who wanted it to stay hidden. Mira closed her eyes and thought of her grandfather's distant expression, of Commander Vane's clipped warning, of Daniel's father staring silently at a wall. Whatever truth lay behind the ban on Terran warfare, it was clearly powerful enough to leave scars on everyone who had touched it. She opened her eyes and began drafting a message to the one person she thought might help her get answers. Commander Leora Vane, the aging Dravith officer who had known the name Vantrell long before Mira ever had reason to ask. Whatever came next, Mira knew there was no turning back now. The question had already taken root in her mind, and she would not rest until she understood why an entire species had been quietly, carefully, deliberately kept away from the wars of the galaxy. Somewhere out among the stars, the truth was waiting, and for the first time in her life, Mira Voss intended to find it, no matter what doors she had to open, and no matter what secrets waited on the other side. Commander Leora Vane did not answer that night, or the next. Mira sent 3 messages over the following 2 days, each one more direct than the last, and each one met with silence. On the 3rd night, just as she was beginning to accept that the old commander wanted nothing to do with her questions, a short reply appeared on her terminal. "Meet me at the lower observation platform. Alone. Tell no one where you are going." Mira read the message twice, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. She grabbed her jacket and left her quarters without telling Daniel, though she suspected he would forgive her for it later, once she had answers worth sharing. The lower observation platform was a quiet, rarely used section of the station, tucked away below the main promenade. Few people came down here except off-duty engineers, checking on old equipment. Mira found Commander Vane standing alone at the railing, her silver eyes fixed on the slow turn of a distant moon. "You are persistent," Vane said without turning around. "That is either a great strength or a great danger. I have not yet decided which it is, in you." "I just want to understand," Mira said. "Why does one word, one planet name, carry so much weight that people go silent whenever it comes up?" Vane finally turned to face her. Up close, the deep lines on her face seemed heavier than usual, carved by decades of memory, rather than simple age. "You ask this question as though the answer will bring you peace," she said. "It will not. Once you know what happened at Vantrell, you will never again see your people, or mine, in quite the same way." "I still want to know," Mira said firmly. Vane studied her for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "Very well, but not here. Walk with me." Vane led Mira through a maze of narrow maintenance corridors until they reached a small, forgotten records room tucked deep beneath the station's main structure. Dust coated the shelves, though most of the archives here had long since been transferred to digital storage. A single console blinked quietly in the corner, its casing scratched and old. "This terminal is not connected to the main network," Vane said, tapping a sequence of commands into the console. "It holds a personal copy of records I saved many years ago, before Directive 9 sealed them away completely. I kept it because I believed someone, someday, deserved to know the truth. I did not expect that someone to be a young Terran officer, with more curiosity than sense." Mira stepped closer, as the screen flickered to life, displaying a timestamp from decades earlier. "Why did you save it?" "Because I was there," Vane said quietly. "I served as a junior officer in the fleet that fought alongside your people at Vantrell. What I witnessed changed how I understood war itself. Mira felt a chill run through her. Tell me everything. Vane was quiet for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the console, as though bracing herself against the weight of memory. I was young then, barely more than a cadet myself, serving as a junior sensor operator aboard a cruiser near the rear of our formation. I did not witness the battle from the front lines the way Colonel Marsh and his pilots did. I watched it unfold through data feeds and distant sensor readings, which in some ways made it more unsettling. I could see the shape of the battle changing without understanding, in the moment, exactly why. What do you mean? Mira asked. I mean that for the first several hours, every report matched what I had been trained to expect. Slow, careful advances, measured retreats when losses grew too high. It was disciplined, and it was failing. Then, within the span of only a few minutes, the entire pattern of the battle shifted so suddenly that my superior officer at the time believed, briefly, that our sensors had malfunctioned. No formation should have been able to move the way the Terran ships moved that day. No commander, by our doctrine, should have accepted the losses Colonel Marsh accepted in those first minutes of his advance. Mira listened intently as Vane continued. Vane sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen. It began during the early years of the Skarn conflict, before the Ascendancy's true strength was understood. Vantril was a border world, rich in resources, strategically vital for controlling 3 major trade corridors. If the Skarn had taken it, the Concordat's eastern territories would have been exposed to invasion. We sent a large defensive fleet to hold the system. It was, at the time, one of the strongest joint forces ever assembled. And it wasn't enough, Mira said, piecing together the shape of the story. No, Vane said. The Skarn brought a force nearly twice our size, supported by weapons technology we had not yet encountered. Within the first hours of the engagement, we lost nearly a third of our ships. Communication between fleet divisions broke down. Commanders hesitated, unwilling to commit to maneuvers that risked heavy losses, following the Concordat's long-standing doctrine of measured, proportional engagement. We were disciplined, we were careful, and we were losing badly. Mira leaned against the wall, listening intently as Vane continued. It was in the middle of the second day of fighting that a small Terran battalion arrived as reinforcement, sent almost as an afterthought, since your people were still new to the Alliance and had only limited combat assets to offer. No one expected much from them. Some officers openly doubted whether they should even be trusted near the front lines. What happened when they arrived? Mira asked. Vane's expression grew distant, as though she were once again standing on the bridge of her old ship, watching the battle unfold. They did not wait for cautious instructions. They did not wait for permission to take risks. Their commander, a man named Colonel Everett Marsh, looked at our failing formation and made a decision that violated nearly every principle of Concordat combat doctrine. He ordered his ships to abandon standard defensive positioning and drive directly into the heart of the Skarn formation. Mira's eyes widened. That sounds like it should have gotten them destroyed. It nearly did, Vane said. But it also did something none of us expected. It broke the rhythm of the Skarn advance. Their forces were organized around a strict, calculated strategy, built to counter predictable, rule-bound tactics. They had never encountered an approach so aggressive, so willing to accept devastating losses in exchange for disruption. The Terran ships tore a path straight through their formation, scattering their coordination, forcing their commanders into confusion. And then the rest of the fleet, myself included, saw the opening and pressed forward. What had been a losing battle turned, within hours, into a full retreat by the Skarn forces. Vantril was saved. The eastern corridors remained secure. Officially, the engagement was recorded as a joint Concordat victory, a triumph of unity between species. Mira frowned. That sounds like something to be proud of, not something to hide. Vane's gaze turned heavy. The victory was celebrated, yes, for a short time. But afterward, something changed in the way the Concordat Council viewed your people. It was not the victory itself that troubled them. It was how it was achieved. It was the willingness of Terran soldiers to charge into near-certain destruction without hesitation, to abandon caution entirely the moment they judged it necessary. It was the discovery that human commanders were capable of making decisions no other species in the Alliance would even consider. So they were punished for winning, Mira said slowly. They were feared for winning, Vane corrected. There is a difference. The Council realized, in that single battle, that Terran forces did not fight the way the rest of the galaxy fought. Every other species in the Concordat, myself included, was raised within a culture shaped by centuries of structured warfare, careful escalation, and negotiated boundaries. Your people came from a world with a very different history, a history filled with conflicts fought without such limits, conflicts that ended only when one side achieved total victory, or total collapse. Mira thought of the history lessons from her childhood, of centuries filled with terrible wars on Earth, wars that had eventually taught humanity the value of caution, though clearly not before leaving deep marks on how humans approached conflict at its core. They were afraid that if Terrans fought regularly within Concordat conflicts, wars that were meant to remain small and controlled would instead grow into something far larger, Vane continued. They feared that Terran tactics, effective as they were, might drag the entire Alliance into forms of warfare it had worked for centuries to avoid. So the ban wasn't about distrust, Mira said. It was about control. It was about fear, disguised as caution, Vane said. The Council did not want to admit that a newly arrived species had shown a level of battlefield decisiveness that unsettled commanders who had studied warfare for centuries. It was easier to frame Terrans as reckless and undisciplined than to admit the truth, that your people were simply willing to do what others were not. Mira felt a strange mixture of pride and unease settle over her. Pride, because her people had not failed at Vantrell, they had saved it. Unease, because the very thing that made them successful was the same thing that now kept an entire species locked out of galactic defense. What happened to Colonel Marsh? She asked. Vane's expression darkened further. He was quietly removed from active duty shortly after the battle, officially due to what the Council called concerns over strategic risk tolerance. He returned to Earth and rarely spoke publicly about Vantrell again. I attempted to contact him years later, hoping to understand more about that day. He declined every request. Mira absorbed this in silence for a long moment. There has to be more to this, she finally said. One battle, however dramatic, does not seem enough to justify decades of restriction. Vane nodded slowly. You are correct. Vantrell was the beginning, not the whole story. There were other engagements afterward, smaller in scale but similar in nature, each one reinforcing the Council's growing unease. Each time Terran forces were involved in combat, even limited combat, the pattern repeated. Swift, unrelenting decisions, willingness to accept losses considered unacceptable by Concordat standards, victories achieved through methods the rest of the galaxy found deeply unsettling. And each time, the fear grew stronger, Mira said. Yes. Until finally, the Council decided the safest course was to remove Terran forces from sanctioned conflict entirely, framing the decision publicly as one of discipline and readiness, while privately acknowledging among themselves that the true concern was something closer to restraint. They did not trust your people to hold back. And in a galaxy built on carefully measured warfare, the inability to hold back was considered the greatest danger of all. Mira stared at the old console, the flickering records of Vantrell still displayed on the screen. For the first time, she understood the weight behind the tired, distant looks she had seen on veterans throughout her life. They were not remembering failure. They were remembering something that had frightened them precisely because it had worked. Thank you for telling me, Mira said quietly. Vane reached out and closed the file, the screen returning to a dim standby glow. Do not thank me yet, Lieutenant Voss. Knowing this truth carries its own weight, and I suspect you are not the type of person who will simply file it away and move on. Mira met the older woman's eyes. You're right, I'm not. Then be careful, Vane said. There are those within the Council who would prefer this history remain buried forever. If you continue pulling at this thread, you may find resistance far stronger than a simple denied application. Mira nodded slowly, though the warning did little to slow the determination building inside her. She had spent her entire life believing her people were somehow lacking, somehow unworthy of full trust among the stars. Now she understood the truth was almost the opposite. Humanity had not been banned for weakness. It had been banned for a strength the rest of the galaxy did not know how to control. As she left the records room and made her way back through the quiet corridors of the station, Mira could not shake the feeling that Vantrell was only the surface of a much deeper story, one that stretched far beyond a single battle, deep into the closed sessions of the Concordat Council itself. If she wanted the full truth, she would need to go further still, into places even Commander Vane could not follow. 3 weeks passed before Mira found her next real lead. She spent her off-duty hours combing through what little public information existed about Colonel Everett Marsh, the officer who had led the Terran battalion at Vantrell. Most records described him only briefly, noting his early retirement and a quiet return to civilian life on Earth. No interviews, no public statements. It was as though he had deliberately vanished from history the moment the fighting ended. Eventually, through a distant contact of Daniel's father, Mira learned that Marsh had passed away several years earlier, but that his daughter, a woman named Claire Marsh, still lived on Earth and had once mentioned old letters her father left behind. Mira requested emergency leave, citing personal reasons, and boarded a transport bound for Earth within the week. Claire Marsh lived in a small coastal town, far from the busy centers where most Concordat business took place. When Mira arrived at her door and explained who she was and why she had come, Claire studied her for a long moment before finally stepping aside to let her in. "My father almost never spoke about the war," Claire said, guiding Mira into a quiet study filled with old books and faded photographs. "But near the end of his life, he began writing things down. I think he wanted someone to understand, even if he could never bring himself to say it aloud." She retrieved a worn leather journal from a locked drawer and handed it to Mira with careful hands. "I have read parts of it. Some of it is difficult to understand unless you were there, but I think you will find what you are looking for." Mira opened the journal that evening in the small guest room Claire offered her, and began to read Colonel Marsh's own account of the battle at Vantrell, written decades after the fact, in the quiet, careful handwriting of a man who had clearly spent years trying to make sense of what he had done. "The Skarn formation," he wrote, "moved with a discipline that unsettled even our allied commanders. They fought like machines executing a program, predictable in their caution, relentless in their advance. I watched 3 Concordat cruisers pull back from an opening in the enemy line simply because Concordat protocol dictated a minimum safety margin before any advance could be attempted. That margin no longer existed. We were losing, and everyone could see it, yet the response remained the same measured caution that had governed every training exercise I had observed since joining the Alliance. I made the decision to break formation because I understood something the other commanders did not yet accept. There was no version of this battle where caution led to survival. The only path forward was through the enemy, not around them. I gave the order, and my pilots did not hesitate, not because they lacked fear, but because they trusted the necessity of the moment more than they feared the risk. We lost 12 ships in the first 6 minutes of the advance. I remember the names of every pilot lost that day, though I will not write them here. What I will write is this: their deaths were not wasted. Each ship that fell created an opening for the ships behind it, and within minutes, the Skarn formation, so carefully organized, began to fracture under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. By the time the rest of the Concordat fleet moved to press the advantage we had created, the Skarn command structure had already begun to collapse into disorder. What followed was not a battle of careful maneuvers, but a rapid, decisive turn that ended the siege of Vantrell within hours, rather than the days or weeks it might otherwise have taken. I was later told, in quiet, careful language, that my methods had raised significant concern among Concordat leadership. No one used the word reckless to my face. They spoke instead of risk tolerance, escalation patterns, and long-term strategic considerations, but I understood clearly enough what they meant. They were afraid of what we had shown them. They were afraid that if given the chance, our people would fight every future conflict the same way, without limits, without the careful restraint that had defined Concordat warfare for centuries. Perhaps they were right to be afraid. I have asked myself many times since that day whether I would give the same order again, knowing what it cost, and every time, I arrive at the same answer. I would, because the alternative was the loss of Vantrell entirely, and with it, the collapse of the Eastern Defense Line. Sometimes the only way to end a battle quickly, and save more lives in the long run, is to refuse to hold back when holding back guarantees failure. Mira closed the journal slowly, her hands trembling slightly, as she absorbed the weight of what she had just read. This was not the account of a reckless commander seeking glory. It was the account of a man who had made an impossible decision under impossible circumstances, and who had spent the rest of his life quietly carrying the cost of that choice. The next morning, Claire showed Mira a second set of documents, records her father had gathered from other Terran veterans who had served in smaller conflicts throughout the years following Vantral. Each account described a similar pattern. Terran forces, when finally given limited combat roles in joint operations, consistently produced results that ended conflicts faster and with fewer overall casualties, but only by embracing tactics that Concordat commanders found deeply unsettling. In one account, a Terran unit stationed along a contested border had ended a prolonged standoff within days by taking calculated risks that Allied commanders refused to authorize themselves. In another, a small group of Terran engineers had proposed a defensive strategy so aggressive in its execution that Concordat officers initially rejected it outright, only to approve a modified version once the alternative, prolonged siege warfare, threatened far greater losses. Every account ended the same way. Terran units achieved decisive results, and every single time, Concordat leadership responded not with expanded trust, but with quiet, careful restriction, slowly reducing Terran combat involvement until, eventually, the door was closed entirely. Mira began to see the shape of the truth Vane had warned her about. This was never about a single battle. It was about a pattern the Concordat Council had studied for years, growing increasingly convinced that Terran willingness to embrace decisive, high-risk action represented a fundamental threat to the careful balance that held their entire system of controlled, limited warfare together. She spent the following days speaking with Claire about her father's final years, learning that despite everything, Marsh had never regretted the choice he made at Vantral, only the isolation that followed it. He had saved a system. He had ended a battle that could have devastated an entire region of Concordat space. And in return, he had spent the rest of his career, quietly pushed aside, treated as a cautionary example rather than a hero. Before leaving Earth, Mira asked Claire one final question. "Do you think the ban is fair?" Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "I think fear rarely produces fair decisions. I think the Concordat saw something in your people that reminded them how fragile their own carefully built peace really was. Rather than face that discomfort directly, they found it easier to simply lock the door and hope the world on the other side of it stayed quiet forever." Mira thought about those words during the long transport ride back to the station. She thought about Colonel Marsh's journal, about the pilots who never came home, about the strange, uncomfortable truth that her people had been punished, not for failure, but for a kind of terrible effectiveness the rest of the galaxy did not know how to accept. When she arrived back at the station, she found Daniel waiting for her at the docking bay, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You disappeared for almost 2 weeks," he said. "I was starting to think Vane's warning had come true." "I found the truth," Mira said simply, holding up the journal, or at least most of it. Daniel's eyes widened as she briefly explained what she had learned. When she finished, he let out a long breath. "So the ban isn't about us being dangerous in the way they say. It's about us being dangerous in a way they can't control." "Exactly," Mira said. "And I think there's still more to understand. Vane mentioned the Council debated this for years before making the ban permanent. I want to know what was actually said in those closed sessions. I want to hear their reasoning directly, not filtered through decades of careful public language." Daniel hesitated. "That kind of access is far beyond anything either of us can request through normal channels." Mira's expression hardened with determination. "Then we'll have to find another way." Daniel studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, his earlier hesitation giving way to quiet resolve. "You know, my cousin works in the archive division. She might know someone with access to old session recordings. It's risky, but if you're determined to see this through, I'm not going to let you do it alone." Mira allowed herself a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Daniel." "Don't thank me yet," he said, echoing Vane's earlier words without realizing it. "We still don't know what we're about to walk into." As the two of them made their way deeper into the station, Mira felt the weight of everything she had learned settling firmly into place. The ban was not simply a rule. It was the result of decades of careful, fearful decision-making by a council, determined to preserve a fragile peace, even at the cost of excluding an entire species from defending the very alliance it had sworn to protect. She was closer now than ever to understanding the full truth. And somewhere deep within the Concordat's most guarded records, the final piece of the story was waiting to be uncovered. Daniel's cousin, a quiet archive technician named Naomi Reyes, agreed to help, after Daniel spent nearly an hour convincing her that Mira's intentions were genuine, rather than reckless. Naomi worked in the lower levels of the Concordat Central Archive, a department responsible for maintaining historical session recordings, most of which remained sealed from public access, under various levels of restriction. "I can get you into the viewing terminal for exactly one session," Naomi said quietly, glancing nervously toward the corridor outside her small office. "After that, the system will flag unusual access patterns, and I will not be able to help you again without risking my position entirely." "One session is enough," Mira said. "I need the debate concerning the Terran combat restriction, the one that led to the final ruling." Naomi typed quickly, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the console. After a tense moment, a small warning light blinked green, and a file appeared on the screen, labeled only with a date and a classification code Mira did not recognize. "This is it," Naomi said. "The final closed session before the ruling was made permanent. I have never actually watched it myself. I always assumed it was simply procedural." Mira sat down in front of the terminal, her pulse quickening as the recording began to play. The council chamber appeared on screen, filled with representatives from a dozen different species, each seated according to rank and seniority. At the center of the room stood a Dravith official, Mira recognized immediately from historical records, Counselor Rayhan Tolk, one of the founding architects of Concordat military doctrine. "We have reviewed the reports from Vantral, and from the subsequent engagements involving Terran forces," Tolk began, his voice steady but heavy with concern. "The results are, by every conventional measure, successful. Terran involvement has consistently shortened conflicts and reduced overall Concordat casualties in the engagements where they were deployed." A representative from a species Mira did not recognize, tall and covered in pale blue scales, rose to speak. "Then why are we debating restriction at all? Should we not be expanding their role, given such clear effectiveness?" Tolk's expression tightened, because effectiveness is not the only measure by which we must judge this alliance's stability. "I ask each of you to consider carefully what we witnessed at Vantral, and in every engagement since. Terran commanders do not simply take risks we consider unconventional. They abandon the very framework of proportional response that has governed Concordat warfare since its founding." Another voice spoke, this one calm and measured, belonging to a small, elderly being seated near the back of the chamber. "Counselor Tolk speaks correctly. Our system of controlled conflict exists, because centuries ago, before the Concordat's founding, unrestrained warfare between rival powers nearly destroyed half the inhabited systems in this sector. The doctrines we follow today, proportional engagement, negotiated boundaries, careful escalation control, were built specifically to prevent conflicts from spiraling beyond containment. Terran forces, whether intentionally or not, operate entirely outside that framework." Mira watched, transfixed, as the debate continued. Some council members argued passionately in favor of expanding Terran involvement, pointing to the undeniable success of every engagement studied. Others argued just as passionately that success achieved through unrestrained methods represented a long-term threat to the very stability the Concordat had spent centuries building. "Consider this scenario," Tolk said, addressing the chamber directly. "Imagine a future conflict, larger in scale than anything we have yet faced, perhaps against a power far stronger than the Skarn ascendancy. If Terran forces are integrated fully into our military structure, and they respond to that conflict the way they responded at Vantral, refusing to hold back, refusing to observe proportional limits, what happens when the enemy responds in kind? What happens when a limited, containable conflict becomes something neither side can control?" The chamber fell silent for a long moment. "We are not suggesting Terran soldiers lack courage or skill," Tolk continued, his tone softening slightly. "Quite the opposite. We are suggesting that courage without restraint, In the context of galactic-scale warfare, carries risks this council is not prepared to accept. Our doctrine exists to prevent total war. Full integration of Terran combat forces threatens the very framework that has kept this alliance from repeating the mistakes of the past. A younger representative, someone Mira did not recognize, spoke up hesitantly. Then perhaps the solution is training, not exclusion. Could we not teach Terran commanders our doctrine of proportional response, rather than banning them from combat entirely? Tolk considered this for a long moment before answering. We attempted exactly that in the years following Vantrell. Terran officers were given extensive instruction in Concordat combat doctrine, and yet, in every subsequent engagement studied, when circumstances grew desperate enough, Terran commanders consistently reverted to decisive, unrestrained action rather than the measured caution we attempted to instill. It appears this tendency is not simply a matter of training. It may be something deeply rooted in the history and instincts of their species itself. Mira felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort as she listened. The council was not wrong, exactly. Her people did carry a history shaped by conflicts fought without the careful limits the Concordat valued so highly. But framing that history as a flaw, rather than simply a different path shaped by different circumstances, felt deeply unfair. The debate continued for what felt like hours, council members weighing the undeniable effectiveness of Terran forces against the very real fear that their methods, if left unchecked, might eventually drag the entire alliance into forms of warfare it had worked centuries to avoid. Finally, Tolk called for a vote. I propose a formal restriction, he said. Terran forces shall be barred from all sanctioned Concordat combat operations, effective immediately, pending further study into methods of integration that might preserve the stability of our shared doctrine. This restriction is not a judgment of Terran character or courage. It is a necessary precaution, born from genuine respect for the power this council has witnessed, and genuine fear of what that power might become if left unrestrained within a system built on careful balance. Before the final vote, one last voice rose from the chamber, belonging to a representative Mira had not noticed before, a quiet, observant being seated near the edge of the room whose species she did not immediately recognize. The being spoke slowly, choosing each word with obvious care. I have listened carefully to this debate, the representative said, and I find myself troubled by something none of you have addressed directly. We speak of Terran forces as though their methods are a flaw to be corrected or contained. But has anyone considered that our own doctrine, however carefully built, may simply be one path among many, rather than the only correct path toward victory? Perhaps what unsettles us is not that Terran methods are dangerous, but that they succeed by means we do not fully understand, and therefore cannot easily control. Tolk considered this for a long moment. You raise a fair point, but control, representative, is precisely what this council exists to maintain. Our doctrine was not built out of preference. It was built out of necessity, following centuries of conflict that nearly destroyed this sector entirely. We cannot simply set aside the lessons of that history because a single species has demonstrated an alternative approach, however effective it may appear in isolated engagements. And if that alternative approach becomes necessary again in the future, the representative asked, what then? Will this council be willing to reconsider, or will fear alone continue to shape this decision indefinitely? Tolk did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he had already considered this question many times over. I hope, representative, that such a moment never comes, but if it does, I trust this council will have the wisdom to recognize it, and the courage to act accordingly, whatever the cost to our pride in having been wrong. The chamber grew quiet once more. Mira watched as council members exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of Tolk's words settling over the room. Even those who had argued most forcefully in favor of restriction seemed, for a brief moment, to hesitate. Then the moment passed. Procedure resumed. The formal proposal was read aloud once more, and the vote was called. The vote passed by a narrow but clear margin. Mira watched the recording end, the chamber fading to black, leaving her sitting in stunned silence in the small archive office. Now you understand, Naomi said quietly, watching Mira's expression. It was never really about doubting your people's ability. It was about fear of what that ability represented. Mira sat back slowly, processing everything she had just witnessed. The council had not banned Terrans out of contempt or distrust in the way she had always assumed. They had banned them out of a complicated, uncomfortable mixture of respect and fear, terrified that the very qualities which made Terran forces so effective might eventually threaten the fragile peace the Concordat had built over centuries. It did not make the ban feel fair, but for the first time, Mira finally understood it completely. "What will you do with this?" Daniel asked quietly, as they left the archive office, Naomi already anxiously erasing any trace of their visit from the system logs. Mira thought for a long moment before answering, "I don't know yet. But I think the galaxy deserves to understand the truth, not the polished version they've been given for decades. And I think, someday, there may come a moment when the Concordat has no choice but to test whether their fear was justified." She had no way of knowing, as she spoke those words, just how soon that moment would arrive. The alarm came without warning, tearing through the quiet rhythm of the station in the middle of the night cycle. Mira woke to the sound of emergency signals blaring through every corridor, followed by an announcement that made her blood run cold. A previously unknown faction, later identified as remnants of the fractured Skarn ascendancy reorganized under a new leader, known only as the Overseer, had launched a coordinated assault against 3 border systems simultaneously, overwhelming Concordat defenses within hours. She rushed to the main briefing hall, where officers from every species gathered in tense clusters, watching live reports flood in from the front lines. The situation, it quickly became clear, was far worse than anyone had anticipated. The Overseer's forces fought with a level of coordination and ruthlessness that far exceeded anything the old Skarn ascendancy had ever demonstrated, adapting rapidly to every measured, proportional response the Concordat fleet attempted. "They are anticipating our doctrine before we even execute it," one exhausted fleet commander reported through a crackling transmission. "Every calculated maneuver we attempt, they counter within minutes, as though they have studied our tactics for years and prepared specifically to exploit them." Mira listened as reports continued to pour in. System after system fell under sustained assault, Concordat fleets forced into repeated retreat, as their carefully measured strategies proved useless against an enemy who refused to follow any recognizable pattern. Casualties mounted rapidly, entire defensive lines began to collapse. 3 days into the crisis, an emergency session of the Concordat Council was called, broadcast openly for the first time in decades due to the sheer scale of the unfolding disaster. Mira watched from the briefing hall, alongside hundreds of other officers, as Counselor Tolk, visibly older and more strained than in the recording she had seen weeks earlier, addressed the gathered representatives. "Our current strategy is failing," Tolk admitted grimly. "The enemy has studied our doctrine extensively and prepared countermeasures for every proportional response our commanders are trained to execute. Continuing along our current path risks the loss of the entire eastern sector within weeks." A tense silence followed, before a different voice spoke, one Mira recognized immediately. Commander Leora Vane, now serving in a senior advisory role, stepped forward within the chamber. "There is another option," she said carefully. "One this council has avoided for decades." The chamber fell utterly silent. "Terran forces," Vane continued, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was suggesting. "We have spent years fearing their willingness to abandon proportional doctrine. But that same willingness may be exactly what is needed against an enemy who has learned to counter proportional doctrine perfectly. An unpredictable, decisive response may be the only strategy this enemy has not yet prepared for." The debate that followed was fierce, echoing the same fears Mira had witnessed in the earlier recording: fears of escalation, fears of losing control over the shape of the conflict. But as reports of continued losses streamed in from the front, the Council's options narrowed with terrifying speed. Finally, faced with the very real possibility of total defeat, Counselor Tolk made the decision Mira had not truly expected to witness in her lifetime. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of caution being set aside in a single moment. "The restriction against Terran combat involvement is suspended. All available Terran forces are authorized for full deployment under Joint Concordat command." Mira felt the announcement hit her like a physical force. After everything, after years of exclusion, after the quiet, careful fear that had shaped her people's place within the Alliance, The door had finally been forced open, not through persuasion, but through desperate necessity. Within hours, Mira found herself standing in a briefing room alongside dozens of other Terran officers, hastily assembled into a joint task force under the command of a seasoned Terran officer named Colonel Owen Blake, a veteran with decades of experience commanding limited support operations, now finally given the chance to lead a true combat force. "We have spent years being told to hold back," Blake said, addressing the assembled officers with quiet intensity. "Today, for the first time, we are being asked not to. I want every one of you to understand exactly what that means. The galaxy is watching. Whatever happens in the coming days will define how our people are seen for generations. We fight, not recklessly, but decisively. We end this quickly, and we end it in a way that saves as many lives as possible, on every side." Mira, now serving as a tactical officer under Blake's direct command, felt a fierce determination settle over her as the briefing continued. This was the moment she had unknowingly been working toward since the day her application was first rejected. Not simply the chance to fight, but the chance to prove that everything the Council had feared, and everything they had misunderstood, could finally be shown for what it truly was. The task force launched within the day, joining a battered Concordat fleet struggling to hold the line at a critical system called Perrin's Reach, the last major defensive point before the Overseer's forces could break through into the heavily populated core systems of the Alliance. Mira watched from her station aboard Blake's flagship as the full scale of the enemy formation came into view, vast and disciplined, moving with the same eerie predictability that had shattered every Concordat counterattack thus far. "They're expecting proportional engagement," Blake said calmly, studying the tactical display. "They've prepared for every measured response the Concordat fleet might attempt. They have not prepared for us." The Terran task force moved differently from the moment the engagement began. Rather than adopting the cautious, layered formations favored by Concordat doctrine, Blake ordered a series of rapid, unpredictable strikes, targeting weak points in the enemy formation, with a speed and aggression that caught the Overseer's forces visibly off guard. Ships moved in patterns that defied conventional tactical logic, taking risks that would have been unthinkable under standard Concordat protocol, yet executed with a precision born from decades of Terran combat instinct, finally allowed to operate without restriction. Mira coordinated targeting data in real time, watching as the enemy's carefully rehearsed countermeasures began to falter against an approach they had never encountered before. Within the first hour, 3 enemy command ships were forced into retreat, their formation fracturing under pressure it had not been designed to withstand. "Commander," Mira reported urgently, watching a new development unfold on her display. "Enemy forces are attempting to regroup along the northern flank. If they succeed, they could encircle the remaining Concordat fleet." Blake studied the display for only a moment before responding. "Then we don't give them the chance to regroup. Redirect our forces. Full commitment. Direct assault on their regrouping formation before they can stabilize." It was exactly the kind of decision the Concordat Council had feared for decades. A full commitment to aggressive, decisive action without the careful, measured caution that defined their traditional doctrine. And yet, watching the tactical display shift in real time, Mira understood clearly why that fear, however understandable, had also been dangerously incomplete. Sometimes restraint saved lives, but sometimes, against an enemy who had learned to exploit restraint perfectly, only decisive action could prevent an even greater loss. Midway through the engagement, a new complication emerged. A secondary Overseer formation, previously undetected, appeared from behind a dense asteroid field near the edge of the system, moving swiftly to reinforce the collapsing northern flank. Mira spotted the movement first, her display flashing with an urgent proximity warning. "Colonel, we have a second formation inbound, approximately 400 vessels, closing fast on our exposed flank," she reported, her voice steady, despite the sudden surge of tension in her chest. Blake studied the display, his jaw tightening. "If they reach the flank before we finish breaking the first formation, we could lose the advantage entirely." Around them, the bridge crew fell into a tense, focused silence, waiting for the decision that would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. Mira felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, aware that whatever choice Blake made in the next few seconds would either preserve everything the Terran task force had fought to achieve, or unravel it completely. "Split the formation," Blake finally ordered. "Half our strength continues the assault on the primary overseer force. The rest comes with me to intercept the second formation before it reaches the flank. Lieutenant Voss, you're with the intercept group. I need your targeting analysis in real time." Mira nodded sharply, adrenaline sharpening every sense as she transferred to a smaller strike vessel, alongside Blake and a compact squadron of Terran fighters. The intercept group moved with startling speed, cutting directly across the system toward the incoming reinforcements, abandoning any pretense of cautious approach. The two forces met in a chaotic, rapid engagement, unlike anything described in official Concordat training manuals. Mira called out targeting priorities in quick succession, guiding strikes against the enemy formation's command vessels, watching as Blake's pilots executed maneuvers so tight and aggressive that even Mira, familiar with Terran tactical philosophy, found herself holding her breath more than once. "They're adjusting formation, attempting to encircle us," Mira warned, watching the enemy pattern shift on her display. "Then we don't let them finish adjusting," Blake replied calmly, already redirecting the squadron into a tighter, more aggressive spread, designed to disrupt the enemy's attempt at coordination before it could take hold. For nearly 20 minutes, the intercept group fought a desperate, close-range engagement, holding the line against a force that outnumbered them significantly. Mira lost track of time entirely, focused only on the rapid flow of tactical data, the constant recalculation of angles and priorities, the sheer discipline required to remain calm amid such chaos. When the primary Concordat fleet finally arrived to reinforce the flank, the secondary overseer formation broke into retreat, unable to sustain further losses against a defense that refused to yield ground. The battle at Perrin's Reach raged for nearly 6 hours, the longest sustained engagement Mira had ever experienced. Terran forces, fighting alongside a renewed Concordat fleet, inspired by the sudden shift in momentum, pressed the advantage relentlessly, refusing to allow the Overseer's forces any opportunity to reorganize or adapt. By the time the enemy fleet finally broke into full retreat, abandoning the assault on Perrin's Reach entirely, the battle had achieved something no Concordat commander had believed possible only days earlier. The eastern defensive line had held, and the core systems of the alliance remained secure. In the aftermath, as recovery teams worked to assist damaged ships and tend to the wounded, Mira stood quietly on the observation deck of Blake's flagship, watching the slow, careful process of restoring order to the battlefield. Colonel Blake approached and stood beside her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and quiet reflection. "We did what they always feared we would do," he said, "and it saved this system." "They were not entirely wrong to be afraid," Mira said. "What we did today could have gone very differently, against a different enemy, under different circumstances." Blake nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But I think today proved something important. Fear alone cannot be the foundation of any lasting strategy. Sometimes the very thing a society fears the most is also the thing that saves it, when every careful, measured alternative has already failed." In the weeks that followed, reports of the battle at Perrin's Reach spread rapidly throughout Concordat space, carried not through official propaganda, but through the accounts of soldiers and commanders from a dozen different species who had witnessed the engagement firsthand. For the first time in decades, public discussion around Terran combat involvement shifted from quiet suspicion to genuine, complicated respect. Councillor Tolk, addressing a special session of the council weeks later, spoke carefully about the events at Perrin's Reach, acknowledging both the undeniable success of Terran involvement and the very real risks that decisive, unrestrained tactics still carried for the long-term stability of Concordat doctrine. "We cannot pretend today's events erase the concerns that shaped our decisions for so many years," Tolk said, "but neither can we continue to ignore the reality that our doctrine, however carefully built, has limits our enemies have learned to exploit. Perhaps the path forward is not full restriction, nor full unrestrained integration, but something more carefully balanced, a genuine partnership that respects both the strengths and the risks each of our peoples bring to the defense of this alliance." The Council's final decision, reached after weeks of careful deliberation, did not fully lift the restrictions that had defined Terran involvement for decades. Instead, it established a new framework, allowing Terran forces limited but genuine participation in future joint operations, with careful oversight, designed to balance the undeniable effectiveness demonstrated at Perrin's Reach against the very real concerns that had shaped the original ban. Mira, now recognized as one of the key tactical officers responsible for the victory, found herself standing once again before a review panel, though this time the outcome felt entirely different. "Your service at Perrin's Reach has been noted with considerable respect," the lead official said, the same cautious formality present in his tone, though something in his expression had shifted since their last meeting. "You are hereby granted full standing as a combat officer within the newly established Joint Operations Framework." Mira accepted the assignment with quiet pride, though she understood clearly that the deeper questions raised by her people's history within the Concordat remained far from fully resolved. The fear that had shaped decades of restriction had not vanished entirely. It had simply been forced, by necessity, into an uneasy, complicated balance with respect earned through undeniable results. Later that evening, standing once again at the same observation window where her journey had begun weeks earlier, Mira found Daniel and Commander Vane waiting for her, both offering quiet congratulations on everything that had unfolded. "You found the truth you were looking for," Vane said, "and in the end, you helped prove both sides of it, the danger the Council always feared, and the strength that danger could become when finally given the chance to serve a greater purpose." Mira looked out at the vast expanse of stars beyond the window, thinking of Colonel Marsh, of the pilots lost at Vantrell decades earlier, of every quiet, careful fear that had shaped her people's uncertain place within the galaxy for so long. "I don't think this is really an ending," she said finally. "I think it's just the beginning of understanding each other properly, for the first time." Somewhere far beyond the station, the stars continued their slow, endless turn, carrying with them the uncertain promise of a galaxy still learning how to balance courage with caution and strength with restraint, one difficult, hard-earned lesson at a time.